Hello, everyone. My name is Kasperanza, and today we are going to be talking about gargoyles, which is probably one of my most favorite monster topic ever. I think gargoyles are so essential to monsters. I think they capture so much of what monsters are. And yeah, I'd like to start off by showing you a gargoyle that I have. His wing broke, which is unfortunate. Um, can try and put his wing together. But yeah, he's a cute little gargoyle that I painted black a long time ago. So yeah, I guess we'll just leave him right here. There is a great documentary on gargoyles that you should definitely watch and check out. So it is absolutely amazing. I learned a lot from this documentary. I also have a poem that will help you think about gargoyles. So, I guard the good with evil to defend against the devil. My ventilation is strong, but I gargle and gurgle. Forgive my grotesque nature, a phallic protrusion on the edge, fantastic stone, vulturesque. I face the north and observe the light that cycles from east to west. So, yeah, that's kind of like how I feel about gargoyles. So let's get into it. Let's actually look at a few pictures. So here's some gargoyles on a cathedral. Gargoyles seem to look like these almost goblins or demons made of stone. And they're usually on the outside of buildings, right? They're vulturesque. They're looking down at the city. They protrude kind of in a phallic way. Um, so yes, they are frightening, scary monsters outside of cathedrals or religious buildings or buildings in general. Let's talk about the etymology and the meaning. So it comes from gargoyle, which means throat. It's a French word for throat, and gargazine or something, which is a Greek word for gargle. And if you think about another word like guillotine, it's like a contraption that cuts people at the throat. Gargoyle sounds like the combination of gargle and gurgle. So you like gargle water, you gurgle water. Because that's what gargoyles actually are. They're kind of like gutters, a way to get rid of water that gets on buildings to just, and over time these spouts turned into these monstrous faces, these monstrous creatures. And let's see, their face is at the end of a spout, as I said, and they are different from grotesques. So a lot of people confuse gargoyles with grotesques. Grotesques are more of just faces rather than protrusions or spouts on a building. Um, but I feel like they're kind of synonymous, honestly, at this point. They're really not that different. But a grotesque, what does grotesque mean? It's a combination of humor and horror combined. And if you think about the mouth and the face is a doorway to the unknown. The face or the mouth is about eating something, right? So when you eat, you go in the hole and it becomes like it's an unknown territory. And when I think about gargoyles, right, there are these monsters around a church. Inside of the church is religion and goodness, and but outside of the church you have all these monstrous creatures. And so when I think about a gargoyle, right, if you're someone who's guttural, if you're someone who is growling, if you're gargling and gurgling, it's someone who has lost their ability to speak. They use their mouth to eat instead of using their mouth to speak. So it's monstrous. That's what makes gargoyles so monstrous. And to attach some astrology here, and I'm going to talk a lot about astrology, but I think of the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, which is really convenient because right now there is a Saturn-Neptune conjunction taking place. But if you think about Saturn, Saturn represents cold hard reality. It represents solid substances, just being solid. And Neptune represents spirits. It represents liquids and water. So if you combine these, if you combine Saturn and Neptune into a conjunction, you get stone and water, or a gargoyle, which is capturing the demonic spirits in stone. Or if you think about it, Neptune in itself is very spiritual and it's about ideals and fantasy. But Saturn is very dark and very heavy and depressing. So a lot of these spirits are being weighed down. So you get these heavy, almost monstrous, depressing spirits, right? They're looking down. They're like vultures. They're almost kind of like depressed. Um, and another thing about gargoyles is that they're constantly being eroded. They're constantly so if you think about it, if you think about water on stone, the stone is being eroded away. Saturn is being eroded by Neptune. Or you can think about another way where the spirits are being solidified. They're being captured in stone. So you see this battle between the spirit and the material world. You see this battle between um, being able to do well spiritually in the material world. And you could also just think of it as redirecting the spirits, where water represents the spirit and Saturn is the stone or the architecture, which is it's kind of solidifying or making barriers or borders, or it's drawing distinctions between all of the different abstractions and values there are in the world, where Neptune is this airy, fairy, watery nature where water is liquid, it's mutable, but Saturn is like starting to divide things. And this is why gargoyles are they're outside of the church. I'm going to refer to Jonathan Pageau because he was the person that really pointed this out to me. But gargoyles are kind of like marking off the end of the church. Because inside the church, you have the center, you have the light and the goodness, you have God. And then outside the church, you have all of these gargoyles. You have all of these gargoyles kind of protecting or defending the church, or representing the end or the edge of where the church ends. And so gargoyles are the monster version or parodies and caricatures of the medieval world or the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages, right? So you can think of gargoyles as fantasies or movies of they were like the blockbuster in the Dark Ages, pretty much. So all of the movies we go to see, all of the superhero movies we see today, I think gargoyles around a church in the Dark Ages were kind of movies or shows of all kinds of different stories. So again, gargoyles are monsters in the sense they are frightening imaginary creatures. They are the perfect depiction of an imaginary creature that is frightening. They are outside of the church. I already talked about that. A really big thing about gargoyles is that they are guardians, which sounds like gargoyle. I mean, they kind of both start with G and stuff, but gargoyles are guardians, or they watch over the church, they watch over the city, and they are warnings. So you can see them as a defense against evil. They turn away real evil with evil. So like these monstrous faces, they do a couple of things. By being scary and predatory, they scare away other predators. They scare away real darkness. And if you're a churchgoer, if you're someone who goes to church, if you're a religious person, these gargoyles show you all kinds of immoralities and evils, and the different face will show you the different immorality. And so they're a constant reminder, they're a constant warning of what can happen when you lose God, or when you lose your way, or when you lose faith, or whatever morality you have, whatever sense of goodness you have. If you don't follow the path, if you don't follow the right path, you're going to end up like one of these monstrous, horrific beings that are trapped in stone. You could say they're in hell. They're in a constant state of despair. And I think it leads me to my next point, where they're kind of they're like they look like they're throwing up or they're in a constant state of shock. And I already talked about this in my last monster video, but all of them, they all look like, again, because you see like these elongated throats and they're very wide-eyed and they have these very distorted and extreme faces. And I like to think of it as they're playing out a drama, they're playing out a story. Um, and this state of shock, like this one is in a major state of shock. You can see how big his eyes are. And this is what can happen when you fall off the religious path, because if you think about it, if you're in a state of shock and you're constantly like gargoyles in many ways are terrified of themselves or terrified of other monsters. Like when I see this little guy right here, I think he saw something just as terrifying as he looks. So when I think about people on the fringes, or when I think about terrifying monsters, or if you think about conflict, if you think about people who are always in conflict, I often think it's because they both see themselves they're both shocked at each other. They're both terrified of each other. They're both in a state of fear, and they don't have this sense of perspective, or they're not in touch with the light or in touch with God or whatever. Yeah, so different faces to show you. So they literally show you a kind of what can go wrong if you don't follow the right path, and they watch over the city. So I like to show you a couple of pictures. So here's some typical, like I've already been showing you pictures, but these are just typical gargoyles. But like I'd like to show you some other kind of gargoyles. So like this is a gargoyle on the Chrysler building. It's some kind of a eagle thing. So it's not nearly as monstrous. Sometimes gargoyles can just be not so extreme. They're just kind of cute or just look really cool. But I really like the Chrysler building because it's an Art Deco building. And it's very interesting to see a building that is so modern, like a skyscraper, still have gargoyles, which are traditionally seen on cathedrals and other religious kind of buildings. So that's one example. And then another example is, oh yeah, these are just gargoyles on cathedrals. Okay. So if you've seen Ghostbusters, there's a really cool these two demon terror dogs, they're called, and these are like, so it's interesting because we often confuse statues with gargoyles, because you could say these aren't even gargoyles anymore. They don't have spouts or anything. But I do feel like they're still gargoyles because they are on top of a building looking down. But these are really cool. And again, they almost capture spirits in the sense that, oh yeah, that's like the Terminator eye, that demon eye that's poking out. A cool example. Oh yeah, here's a realistic version of the demon dogs. I talked about this gargoyle already in my other monster videos, but this is where I'm really getting into the examples and just how many variations and differences there are between different statues and gargoyles and imaginary creatures that can be captured in stone. But I really, really like this one. I mean, you really see like the tongue, you see kind of like there's almost inability to speak with the tongue sticking out. And this kind of guttural, like when I look at this, I imagine some kind of guttural noise coming from this gargoyle. And it's so cool. They're so terrifying. And yeah, if you look at that. And it's a warning, right? Because this gargoyle is from Lord of the Rings. It's the doorway into Minas Morgul, and it's warning you of how evil Minas Morgul is. It really captures and warns you of the evil. And then I also want to talk about superheroes a little bit because superheroes, especially like Batman, really reminds me of a gargoyle. Batman and Spider-Man. I mean, first of all, Batman, he named himself after a bat. He kind of captured the spirit of a bat. And Batman is a superhero and a vigilante who watches over the city. Like you can see how he's kind of just he's watching over the city. He's literally standing, I think I'm not sure if that's the Chrysler building gargoyle, but it's showing you how he's like a gargoyle. So gargoyles don't always have to be these scary spirits. They could also represent like superheroes or and even a vigilante, right? Batman isn't really part of the law. He's not really the center. He's more he's at a distance. And that's the thing about gargoyles. When you're on the edge of the church, if you think about a church and the value system, if you're a gargoyle and you're on the very edge, you're able to see everything that's happening. And the other thing is like, how did Batman come to be? Batman came to be um because originally he was afraid of bats, and so he became Batman. He kind of became the thing that he was afraid of so that he could scare other criminals, especially because Batman believes that criminals are superstitious. And so if they're superstitious, they're very likely to be afraid of a gargoyle or someone like him to keep them in line, to keep them moral again. So gargoyles are like they're like capturing fear. Especially again when you go back to the idea how gargoyles are like shocked with they have these eyes that are wide open because they're in a state of they're paralyzed in their fear. So gargoyles in many ways they're capturing fear. And so yeah, so Batman is a really good example. And then I also have Spider-Man. Spider-Man is very similar. Like even first of all, he's a spider, like a bat, so kind of a scary, creepy animal thing. And it's really cool because if he's like a gargoyle looking down at the city. Here he is at the Chrysler gargoyle thing. And there's a really cool video in the third Spider-Man with is it Tobey Maguire? Yeah. Um, you can literally see him as a gargoyle. He's on some kind of a. You can just see all these gargoyles around the structure here. And with him on top of a gargoyle, you really see how he is a gargoyle. And this is also the scene when he is thinking about giving up being Venom because Venom is like the dark side. And I love how kind of with Batman and Spider-Man, especially when Spider-Man is Venom, they're both kind of depressed. They go through a kind of depression phase. They both struggle a lot with the dark side, right? There's a darker half. It's not very chipper and happy. Like when I look at Batman, I mean, he's a superhero of Gotham, almost like a superhero of a gothic cathedral. Or Spider-Man when he's on top. I mean, he's like one of these depressed statues or these angels that are like looking down. It's I like how there's a kind of depression or like a darkness to them because I think it's a much more realistic than a normal superhero like Superman. So I just thought that was pretty cool. Oh yeah, so the light and the dark half of this picture, you got the light Superman, the dark Superman, more of him looking like a gargoyle. And then I have some pictures myself. I was walking in the city one day and I walked past this church and I saw these little gargoyles up here. You can hardly see them. They're really small. Um, but they're there. And I'm also wearing my pup mask, kind of like how the pup mask is like Batman. Like I feel a strong affinity between gargoyles. And I also took this picture too, which was kind of cool. So, but the spirit, this idea of looking down at the city and protecting it and guarding it and having this perspective of what's really happening. So, yes. So gargoyles, a lot of the time, they look like they're throwing up They look like they're looking down, like there's like this poison coming out of them. Especially going back to the astrology, when you combine Saturn and Neptune, you often get poisons or dangerous liquids. So I often think of like a gargoyle as poisoned and they're trying to throw up, or there's like this gutter, especially. I mean, there's two things to throwing up. You're trying to get rid of the toxins and the poisons because you're diseased and you're in a state of decline. But I also think that gargoyles are, or when it comes to throwing up is like one of the worst feelings ever. There's nothing worse than just feeling sick, feeling like your stomach is floating and it's not stable. And so when I think about gargoyles, I just think they're in hell. They're in a really bad mental state. And I like to compare it to the Gouda. I like to compare it to the Buddha and the Mona Lisa, where gargoyles are in a state of shock and they're like throwing up. There's this intensity. There's this really intense negative emotion. Most gargoyles really are goofy and goblin-like, and they're very distorted, stressed out, being pulled in directions. Anyway, so if you look at the Buddha, so yeah, if you compare a gargoyle to the Buddha and the Mona Lisa, you almost see like his eyes are half open. He's almost asleep. He's not in a state of shock. He's in a state of calm. And if you look at the Mona Lisa, her eyes are they're like half open. She is very calm. The eyes are just resting. Like the eyelids are resting over the eyes as opposed to the eyelids being pulled open. It almost reminds me of the psychopath in A Clockwork Orange when he's forced to have his eyes opened, if you remember that scene. Forgot the name of the psychopath in it. I don't know why it's slipping my mind, but anyway. Next I want to talk about is Jonathan Pageau and Christianity and power structures and hierarchies, because I think this is where gargoyles really start to become interesting philosophically. So on the one hand, they represent these monstrous creatures, but I think gargoyles can be seen as monstrous in different ways depending on who's looking at them and why they were erected in the first place. So let's watch a few videos. So there is this video where Jonathan Pageau is with all of these Christian white men and they're discussing the Bible, and it's incredibly fascinating. So let's listen.
With four faces, or sometimes with parts of the body. So
it's a monstrous chimera.
It's a chimera. It looks like more like a sphinx, you know.
So that's the vision of Ezekiel.
Yes, right.
It's like,
yes, the gargoyles are like chimeras or chimras, right? A chimera is like an ugly dragon. It's a combination of a python, eagle, and lion or feline.
A good example of that. And so it's like, so what is going on? Why is that? And it has to do with the edge. That's why the cherub is placed on the outside of the Garden of Eden and is like a transition, a guardian between the inside and the outside.
So this is the part this is where I learned when Jonathan Pageau said that gargoyles are on the edge of like a value system or on the outside of the church. I think this is very important. And so Jonathan Pageau, even though he is a conservative and a typical Christian in a lot of ways, he does have some very insightful and profound things to say in regards to symbols and monsters and all of that stuff.
The place that is between the inside and the outside is the thing that has a confused identity. That is what it is. And so it has a function in the whole cosmos, this notion of something which is a mixture, which is many things at the same time, but it is on the edge all the time. So you see it
it can't be made central.
No.
Because the central thing isn't a chimera.
And so you see it as
Okay, so we're starting to see that there's a center and then there's a margin. So I think that's really important to think about philosophically. Like this idea of a center and a margin. What is the center? What is the margin?
fractal, like in this part, you have it on the veils, of the different veils of the tabernacle, and then finally on the inside, even in the holiest place, it becomes the lower support, like the seat, you could say, for the glory of God to kind of manifest itself on or behind, so it hides because it's not of the identity. So it's like that's what you can understand a veil that way. It's like this intermediary space.
It's almost guarding like a gargoyle. And
that's what gargoyles are, the same thing. If you want to understand
Yes.
gargoyles, the cherub is already
Yes, gargoyles are like guardians. They're monstrous faces that warn you or guard from, like, do you want to leave this value system? Do you want to leave the center, or do you want to go off into the unknown, which is basically death? Do you want to die?
already there in scripture.
We've talked about before that there's two versions of the monstrous that has to be kept at the fringe. One is too much sameness, right? And the other...
So I've actually never heard about that. So I'm going to have to look into that, because the idea of a monster having too much sameness, I mean, that's very interesting. Maybe it has something to do with the idea of how nature, in order to procreate and to live in a world that is healthy and vigorous, you need to mix genes and you need to have diversity. Because if everything is the same, then the weaknesses aren't covered by other strengths. If you think about your partner or your marriage partner or whatever, if both of you are too much the same, if both of you are kind of just the same entity, you can't cover each other's weaknesses. You can't reflect each other's issues and improve each other's issues. You kind of can both fall into the same problems and not even know it, because both of you are the same. So that's what I think.
There is too much of the chaotic thrown together, the monstrous chimera, right? They're different, but they guard from different things.
Identity and diversity.
Yeah. And so that's a guard. Like, don't go beyond
tyrannical unity and diversity.
There are two excesses. One which would be excess unity, and we'll see
That's
some
no
of that.
fringe allowed, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Excess
And we'll
unity
see
is
some
no
of that
fringe allowed.
in the story of Miriam and the Ethiopian wife, I think, has to do with that exactly. Where it's she's insisting on too much purity, so because of that.
Okay, yeah, and that, I feel like they kind of go off track. Okay, and then there's another part where Jonathan Pageau, he's on the Michael Knowles show or channel. I don't know. I hate Michael Knowles. I don't think he ever says anything worthwhile. But Jonathan Pageau, even though he's talking to Michael Knowles, he's still saying something really profound when he talks about gargoyles. Let's listen to what he has to say.
That are there, and there's multiplicity, and there's all this stuff. Then in the corners and in the edges and then on the outside, that's where we have gargoyles. And gargoyles are fine, right, in their proper place. And that's what they are. They're ambiguous, they're humorous.
Okay, so that's another thing. So he says they're fine where they are. So, and I guess that's important. All value systems, all value structures, even if it's very far from the value structure, there's still, you still need something that doesn't fully represent it, but is still part of it, I guess.
They're confused. They're a strange mixture of different identities. They usually have a kind of irreverent nature to them sometimes.
So I feel like when he's talking for this part right here, he's just talking about monsters. This is exactly what monsters are. They're a mixture of identities. They're ambiguous. They're terrifying. They're foreign. You can't make out what they actually are. They represent the unknown. They're faces of the unknown.
And they're even kind of even off key, like a little salty, let's say. And they have their place in the structure, but only if they're in their proper place. If you take a gargoyle and you put it on the altar, like, you're in trouble. And I think that this is what's going on, is that exceptions will always exist. So there's a sense in which the argument of let's say the LGBT argument, to say that there's some fluidity is true, but the fluidity is on the edges. It's always in the exceptions and on the edges and in strangeness. But you can't make strangeness the thing that you worship, because then everything falls apart. Okay,
so I think this is very interesting, and this leads me to the next thing that I want to talk about. So gargoyles are on the fringe, and I've also heard Jonathan Pageau say a couple times that gargoyles are irreverent, right? So they're beings that, and I think this irreverence comes from the fact that they are beings who don't have the same values as you do. So they can come off as irreverent. They can come off as, because if you think about something outside of the church, it's not really worshiping God. It's not facing towards God. It's facing out. It's looking out. It's almost like it's worshiping something else. It's not worshiping the center. It's worshiping another center, something else. So this leads me to a bunch of questions that I have for conservatives and centers and value structures and hierarchies and power structures and all of this stuff. Is that, like, is there an objective center? What is the center of the cosmos? Because I'm going to start talking about the solar system, because I think it's a perfect metaphor for what we're talking about here. What is the center of the cosmos? What is the center without an outlier? So I feel like in order to have a center, you need to have an outlier. You need to have strangeness and weird combinations on the outside. And it's just interesting to me. The reason why I ask these questions is that many churches and religions believe they are the center, and yet they're always conflicting with each other. They're always fighting with each other. It's two centers that think that they are the center, and they're trying to get everyone else to believe that they are the center. And I think that is a problem. Like, there's a lot of conflict. I mean, if you think about Israel and Palestine and Gaza, or Ukraine and Russia, why are they going to war? It's because you have two centers that believe that they are the center, when I really think their values are arbitrary, and then there is really no higher or lower center or whatever. So if you think about it, there's the solar system, and then there's the Satan system. So if you think about the sun, which is the center of the solar system, it gives off all the light and all the warmth. You could say the sun is God. And then at the very end of the solar system, you have Saturn. Saturn is the furthest planet from the sun that can be seen from a naked eye. This is why in ancient traditions and in ancient history, ancient people did not know about Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. They only knew about Saturn. Saturn was the furthest planet that they could see. So Saturn, it represents the gargoyle. It represents, it's part of the system. It's part of the solar system. It's part of the power structure, but it's at the very end. You could also say Saturn is Satan. Saturn is satire, right? So like you have all these words like Saturn, satire, satellite, Satan, satanic, Saruman and Sauron. So if you watch Lord of the Rings, the villains are Saruman and Sauron, and they sound very similar to Satan. They sound very similar to Saturn. They represent Satan, right? Because wherever there is a god, and wherever there's a system of values, and there's a center, and there's the highest hierarchy, there's the highest in the hierarchy of values, you're always going to have the opposite. You're always going to have a Satan. You're always going to have the opposite of those values. And so that's what these gargoyles represent. Or you could say gargoyles represent the beginning of the end. As we've talked about already, right? They are these monstrous conglomerations, these ambiguous identities that are part of the system, but they're really not part of it. And this is why they're guardians, because they're basically showing you, like, if you go beyond this power system, if you go beyond this solar system, you will end up in a new solar system. You're going to end up in the unknown. You're going to end up in completely foreign territory. So last safeguard before the unknown. And again, this goes back to the idea of perspective and Saturn, right? So if you think about the sun, which rules over Leo, and if you think about the moon, which rules over Cancer, these are the biggest and the closest planets. So if you're on Earth, and if you look at the sun is the biggest and the brightest planet. I like to think of it as a planet because I'm an astrologer. It's the biggest and brightest planet in the sky. And then the moon reflects the sun. It's like the second biggest planet in the sky. And then if you look at Saturn rules over Capricorn and Aquarius. And Capricorn and Aquarius, especially Aquarius, have a lot to do with having a very big perspective. Because if you're Saturn, you see the whole solar system. You see the whole hierarchy of values. You're able to question the system. You're able to revolt against the system. You see what's really happening. You see the structure for what it is. And so if you're Saturn, in many ways, you're able to kind of make your own. Not only can you watch over the solar system, like Batman or Spiderman, right? Because you have this perspective, you can keep the right. You can wrap it around like a satellite. You're always orbiting. You're always watching. You're always making sure that everything is running smoothly. I mean, that's the whole purpose of Capricorn and Aquarius, especially Aquarius. Aquarius is the humanitarian, not Leo, ruled by the sun. Leo is the king. Leo is the center. If you think about it, the sun is so bright that it really can't see what's happening because it's the center. But if you think about Saturn and Satan, Satan sees all that's happening. So it can make the choice either to keep the solar system functioning, or it can start a kind of system of its own. It can leave. It can leave the sun and create like its own thing, or which is really interesting. I mean, if you look at Saturn, Saturn literally is a symbol of itself as a satellite because it has these big rings around it. The rings around it represent the satellite. It represents this idea of being able to go around the whole solar system. So, okay, so what's the next thing? So you might be asking, well, what about the other planets of the solar system? What about Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto? Well, Uranus represents the queer planet, which is really interesting. Uranus is tilted on its axis. Uranus also represents sudden change and shock, right? So this is flipping the table. Uranus traditionally, or not traditionally, but modernly rules over Aquarius. And Aquarius, again, is opposite of Leo. So if Leo represents the king and the center, Aquarius represents the opposite of that. It represents the outside. So, and this is very interesting because I've heard Jonathan Pageau, right? He talks about how the chimera is the combination of the lion, the eagle, the man, and the bull. Well, what are those? Those are the four zodiac signs: Taurus, which is the bull; Aquarius, which is the man; Leo, which is the lion, or lion, which is Leo, and then you have, what was the last one? Scorpio, which Scorpio, it represents a scorpion, but it can also represent an eagle. A Scorpio is often also seen as an eagle. And so this is why astrology and I think Christianity have a lot more in common than Christians like to believe. And a lot of there's a huge overlap and connection with a lot of this stuff. But anyway, so Uranus represents shock. It's also the queer planet. So, and it's the planet outside of Saturn, right? It's the next planet after Saturn. So you could say this is where you get crazy gargoyles, and Neptune represents spirits and fantasy. So it's things that aren't even real at this point. Because all of the other planets, when you have Mercury and Venus and Mars and Jupiter, they represent all of the different occupations and substructures of the superstructure. Or like, you know, you have the sun, which is the center, and then you have Mercury, which represents commerce and business. And then you have Jupiter, which represents philosophy and bigger ideas. And being able to be truly religious. And then you have Venus, which represents women and femininity and beauty. And you have Mars, which is sex, anger, and aggression. So all of these different planets represent different parts of the whole value structure. And then you have Saturn, which represents the very end, kind of the end of time. Saturn is also often associated with time. And after that, you get to Neptune, which represents fantasy and things that aren't real, right? You get imaginary ideas, things that go beyond the structure that you have. And then you have Pluto, which is the furthest planet from the solar system. It's not even seen as a planet at this point. It's almost ignored because Pluto represents power, death, and transformation, in the sense that all structures, all systems inevitably collapse and fall apart, or they go through changes and transformations. And that's what Pluto represents, in the sense that all structures can become entirely different structures. So, I guess my question to all of this is our sun merely another gargoyle? How do we know that our solar system, like if you think that you're worshiping God and you believe that there's a center and there's an altar and there's a right way to live, and LGBT people are on the margin and they should stay on the margin, how do you know that your center is not just another part of the margin? Especially when you go to war with other religious people like Muslims, or what about other religions, Eastern religions, and the Vedic traditions and Eastern philosophy like Taoism? How do you really know that you're the center? And it's very interesting because if you take our solar system is, I don't even know if it's not even the center of the galaxy. It's very far off to the side. In many ways, you could think we are a bunch of gargoyles orbiting a gargoyle, which is orbiting another gargoyle, which is orbiting the center. So we are very far off track. I mean, if you look at a human being in many ways is pretty monstrous and ambiguous. It is not pure ultimate light. It is not the absolute center. Absolutely. Of course, the values are relative, right? If you are a human being, there are values that you build your life around. There is a center. There is an idea of good and bad for you as a human being. But if you look at an alien, or if you look at the whole universe if you look at the whole universe, our values as human beings are just probably values of just what could be seen as just gargoyle values. So like what should and shouldn't be the center? How do you know what the center is? And it's going to lead me to my next point, hierarchy versus networks, which is all about power. But first, I just want to talk about Rahu and Ketu, because Rahu and Ketu in astrology, they represent like anti-planets or shadow planets. Rahu isn't actually a planet, so I have a few. So Rahu represents the dragon's head, which is very similar to a gargoyle. There's a story, a myth a long time ago where a gargoyle came from the dragon Gargoyle. And Gargoyle, his head was cut off, or I don't know if his head was cut off or what, but like he was killed. God or some kind of religious figure killed Gargoyle, and Gargoyle was mounted onto the church as a representation or a symbol of God's authority and purity and the goodness and bad. And I like to think of that as, in this structure, in this power structure, in our sense of values of good and evil, this represents the good, this is the bad, don't do the bad. That's what Gargoyle represents. But also when I think about Rahu, Rahu isn't an actual planet in astrology. He's a shadow planet. I'm not going to get into the astronomy of it. It's some kind of mathematical thing, but he's symbolized by this creature, this crazy monster that's eating the moon, or I guess eating the sun, eating the luminaries. Because if you think about the sun and the moon represent the values. They're the source of light and goodness. But Rahu is the shadow planet, and it has a lot to do with eclipses. Where is it? Where is the... yes. This is a really cool image by powerfortunes.com. And I love how it's called Power Fortunes. But yeah, so Rahu and Ketu. Ketu represents the tail. Rahu represents the head. It represents the face, the monstrous face that eats the planets. And it's responsible for the eclipses, right? So when the moon is eclipsed or when the sun is eclipsed, right, the light is blocked. And when the light is blocked, it's as though the whole value structure falls apart, or it's flipped on its head. It's reversed. So that's what I love. I often see Rahu as like, so if you could think of Saturn as the guardian of the solar system, and you can think of Rahu, and it's so interesting because Rahu in Vedic astrology, or just astrology in general, he represents foreign lands. He represents desires. I have some really cool Yu-Gi-Oh card examples, like Pot of Greed and Pot of Avarice. Oops, not the Buddha, but we're done talking about that. But Pot of Desires, you see this kind of ghoulish, ghastly gargoyle faces. And Rahu represents foreign lands. It represents foreign things, right? Foreign things, monsters. It represents these dark. I also really like these masks. Tibetan Buddhist New Year, they have these really cool Rahu looking gargoyle monstrous masks that I think really capture the essence of this foreign that I just think is so cool. I love this the idea of you see the teeth and it's like eating this ball of light. It's such a so cool. But anyway, so that's Rahu and Ketu, the dragon's head and tail, eating the light. And it leads me to my last section, which is hierarchy versus networks, and how everything can be boiled down to like a kind of power structure. And I can just hear Jordan Peterson over here giving off his little like, you're just a postmodernist and you reduce everything to power and blah, 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 blah. But this is why Jordan Peterson is a conservative, and he hates this argument because it unravels what conservatives believe to be the center of all truth and all light and everything when you just declare everything as power. So, but I think it's important to talk about because it doesn't just have to do with power. It also has to do with merit and delivering real values. But so it leads me to my next. There's this really cool video by J-Reg, and I don't even know if he's a serious political thinker, but I saw this chart and he talked about this chart and I just thought it was like the coolest. I mean, this really captures what I'm talking about in so many ways. And I just think it's so cool and it's so profound and it's so interesting, right? Because if you think about these big circles, I mean, he doesn't even need to explain it. You can just see. I know exactly what he means with the political compass. And another word for political is power. Power compass. Well, what is politics? It's about how we create power structures. Who's going to have the power and who's not going to have the power. Everything can be reduced to power. Power is everything. Why do you think the last planet in the solar system represents power? Right? Pluto is about power. So you have the authoritarian left, which has, so these really big circles, in my opinion, represent the sun. They represent the value system, the center. It represents all source and all light. So the people who can deliver the most values are also tend to be the most powerful. So power and being able to deliver values are essentially the same thing. It's the source of all light. Everyone orbits the sun. All the planets orbit the sun. We all need the light to survive and to feel happy. So all of these are like the source of power. And so you have different power structures. So what's really interesting is the authoritarian left, the source of power is making everything equal. And then the authoritarian right is God, and then there's sub power. So like, and I see these as just different planets. So it's just really interesting. So like when I think about, I don't know what I'm trying to say, but if you think about the libertarian left, they're all equal. It's a network, which is literally Aquarius. Aquarius represents, I mean, it's the complete opposite of Leo and the sun, right? If Leo represents the aristocracy and the king, Aquarius represents the humanitarian and equal, where everything's equal. Aquarius also rules over the 11th house, and the 11th house is the house of networks. So Aquarius is this complete opposite of Leo, where we're going to make everyone equal. We're going to talk to everyone. So that's the libertarian left. This is why the left wing is so disturbing to right-wing people, because the left wing does not have values at all. Like, in order to get everyone on an equal playing field, you can't have any values. You can't have a hierarchy of values. You can't place anything above anything else. This is something that Jordan Peterson talks a lot about. So everyone is equal because no one values anyone. No one values anything. it's like the value itself is equality at the expense of everything else. So you don't have good doctors and bad doctors. You don't have good lawyers and bad lawyers. You don't have productive people and unproductive people. You just have people who are not distinguished or distinct from any other. So you just get this network of everyone being the same, because no one is good or bad at anything. No, everyone refuses to have values, right? And then so when you get the authoritarians, so the left wing, in my opinion, is just, this is just my opinion, but I think the left wing is just stupid, because the left they want to live in a world where values don't exist. They want to live in a world where there is no such thing as someone who's better than someone else. Everyone is the same. But that's just impossible. Everyone is so different. Everyone has different values, first of all, which is going to lead me to talk about the right. But the left wing is just insane, because this network thing is just impossible, in my opinion. And when you have an authoritarian left, it's possible to a degree, but it just ends where everyone dies. So the left wing just needs to go. So the right wing is the only thing that's left. The big difference between them is that the right wing does value hierarchies. The right wing does have a sense that there are values in the world and there are people who are better than others. The question is, which values should we have? Well, the authoritarian right, if you're a Christian, right? God is the highest value. And that's it. He's the highest value. He's the only value you can have. This whole hierarchy is around God, and everything else comes from God and everything, right? So it's really just a solar system where the sun is the center and everything orbits around it. And then you have the libertarian right, which is, to me, is far more dynamic and a much better, I think it really captures the reality of what's happening. Because when you look at all these other three, when you look at the authoritarian right, left, and lower left, they're very, you can see how they're not very dynamic. There's not a lot of, they're rigid. They're precise. They're black and white. It's like a complete network or a complete equality or this one value structure. But the libertarian right, and this is why I'm a libertarian, right-wing libertarian, because this power structure is much more reflective of the real reality. There's not one value system. Not everyone believes in God. Even if you live in a world where everyone does believe in God, even though we don't anymore, because one, God is dead, as Nietzsche said, as people all say all the time, and that's the only thing people quote by Nietzsche, but yeah, it's still a good quote, right? There's not just the God hierarchy. In a sense, there are some people who are better than others, and there are some value structures that are valued more than others that make some people who are better than others even more better than others. And this is why the libertarian right is feared by people, and why everyone seems to hate capitalism, because capitalism values capital, right? And capital is this amorphous thing that is indiscriminate and almost foreign, in the sense that human beings don't have control over capital. If you look at all these other systems, human beings are in control. There's a sense of order. There's a sense of like, everyone is in their place. I know where everyone is. But if you look at the libertarian right, there's all of these different value structures and hierarchies taking place, and they're all competing, and it's dynamic, and it's constantly changing. It's changing way too much or way too fast. And this is where I'm going to talk about accelerationism soon. But yeah, so this is just really cool, because you see how like you have a lot of suns in the libertarian right, and then you have Mercuries and Venuses and Mars, and you have Saturns, and you have some planets that are just not even connected to anyone. You have some planets that are the center. You have some planets that are acting like kings that aren't actually kings. You have some planets that are kings but are too much kings, but they're not really kings, because not the whole value structure is orbiting it. it's just really interesting to think about. I really think of these as just different solar systems, different hierarchy systems, and the libertarian right is the most dynamic, the most all encompassing, and the most reality based, because this is how reality actually is. Reality is not just a simple solar system, it's a bunch of solar systems within solar systems that are in flux and are changing. Like this big dark circle is not going to be the center forever. It's not this rigid structure like authoritarian right where it's going to be like this forever. This giant circle is going to get small one day, and then it might get big, and then it might get small again. I mean, that's just how capitalism and libertarian hierarchy works. Okay. So, Sun and the Moon are hierarchical. Saturn is network. Aquarius is about the network. Capricorn is about going up the hierarchy. Okay, so yeah, I've already talked about all of that. I forgot to mention this. Where was this? I didn't put it in my notes. What the heck? Oh yeah, hierarchy versus networks. There's this really great video. So this is so cool, but if you want to see an explanation in depth of hierarchies and networks, watch this video by Sam Vaknin. Future is networking, hierarchies are dead. I'm not entirely sure that's true. And one thing is one thing that I dislike is that he's talking as if there's only a network and there's only a hierarchy. I think there can be a combination. There can be a flux and a constant readjusting of hierarchies and networks, but it's really good when we break up these concepts into two separate things, because that way they can be fully understandable. So he talks about the differences between networking and hierarchies. He talks about the difference between the left wing and the right wing, essentially, without even really knowing it. But yeah, it's a really great video. I gotta watch it again. Even though I watched the whole thing, I still feel like I didn't understand it. But it's an incredible video that gets to the root of, I think, what J-Reg is talking about with the political compass. So, and the final thing that I want to say, so how does this have to do with gargoyles again? Well, again, gargoyles are the outside. So if you think about, to go back to this, the gargoyles are like these little circles right here. So like, this is why I love the libertarian right, because I think, like, if you look at the libertarian left, everyone is a gargoyle. There is no center. Everyone is just, it's kind of like this weird combination where everyone is the center and no one is the center at the same time. So it's like this anti-gargoyle, anti-solar idea. And then so if you look at the libertarian left, you have all these gargoyles, and then you have one sun, and all of the gargoyles are not seen as gargoyles because the center wants them to believe that they're all good or something. And then you have the sun, and then you have these little planets down here, these little Saturns. These are your gargoyles down here. And then with the libertarian right, you have like gargoyles that are the center, who are solars and kings without being the actual king. So and then you have kings that seem like really big kings, but they're not really kings at all. It's hard to think about. But it's like, yeah, everyone in the libertarian left is a sun and a Saturn at the same time. You have one sun, and then you have all Saturns, and then you have a sun and a Mercury and a Jupiter, and then you have Saturns down here. And then you have like Saturns and Jupiters that are pretending to be suns, and then you have a sun right here, which is that acts more like a giant Mercury because it doesn't have all of the planets operating around it. Like I don't know. I'm not really sure what I'm talking about, but it's just cool to think about. And the last thing I want to say is that as an egoist, I just ask myself, where do I want to be in the hierarchy and network? And do I want to be part of the hierarchy and network? Do I really want to be the center? Or do I want to be the fringe? Center of what exactly? The fringe of what exactly? Maybe it's better to be the fringe. Or I mean, in some cases, I think it is. Maybe start your own hierarchy. Maybe start your own network within a hierarchy. I mean, there's a lot of different, like when I think about, Jonathan Pageau, where he seems to think that there's just the center and everything should just go around the center. I just don't think that's how. I think the world is a much bigger place, and I think it's a lot more complex than that, where I think there are centers that operate as margins, and I think there are margins that operate as centers, and then there's centers and margins that operate in between. I think you find a lot of different variations, and I'm a big believer in the libertarian right because I think this is a much more accurate reflection of what's happening. And you should just figure out, where do I want to be in this network? Do I want to be the really big circle? Do I really want to be like President Trump with all of the sycophants orbiting around me? Do I want to be my own king with my own YouTube channel where everyone's orbiting around me and my channel? Or do I just want to be off and alone in a forest, like this little circle? Or do I really just want to be a part of a church where I'm just a churchgoer and I worship God? Or I don't know. I just think, do whatever makes you happy. And just, if you're not happy, try to move and orient yourself into a position that would make you happy. And that's it. That's everything that I have to say about gargoyles, centers and margins, and power structures. Thanks for listening. See ya.